The cold weather affects the human body by allowing it to no longer regulate the way that we normally would. So our cells start to act differently than the way they're supposed to. Our brain can become affected where we get confused all the way to becoming unresponsive in some states. We also are no longer able to do fine coordination with our fingers, and our gross motor skills are affected, so we can't do the daily tasks that we would normally do. Our body can start to shiver in some states, but it can also stop shivering in others, and so it can really affect every aspect of what we would need to do to survive. My name is Dr. Nicole McAllister, and I'm an emergency medicine physician at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. Some common cold weather injuries are trench foot, and that's something that's a non-freezing injury, but then you can have frost nip, frostbite, hypothermia. You can have other injuries such as trauma as well. Frost nip presents as similar to frostbite, but it is not something that is potentially permanent. Frost nip is when you can form little crystals inside the tissues, but those will resolve without any permanent damage. And so this is anything that's exposed to cold for a prolonged period of time. Frostbite is when your tissues are exposed to cold and they form crystals in them, but those crystals can cause damage. The damage isn't always permanent, but it can be permanent depending on how long your exposure was. Symptoms of that are initially you have loss of sensation, you can have severe pain, sometimes you might lose pain eventually if the exposure is prolonged. Your tissues will become pale and sometimes they can become purple as it progresses. You can also become kind of a waxy sensation in the skin. Hypothermia has a range of signs and symptoms. It really depends on how cold your body temperature becomes. And as the body progresses through the different symptoms and phases, you can start to progress in those signs. So initially, when your body is a little bit colder than it should be, you can still be normal, speaking normal, acting normal. But then as it progresses through mild and then into moderate hypothermia, you start to get some confusion, maybe a little bit slow to respond to answers. You lose those fine motor skills, so you can't do this little things that you would normally do, like buttoning a shirt or writing. You start to shiver a little bit as well, which is your body's response to the cold to try to produce heat. Then as you progress through and you continue to be exposed to cold weather, you start to become less responsive. So you might not be responding at all. You might be sleepy and you might even go into a coma and become unresponsive. Your body will stop shivering at a certain point because it can't do that anymore, and you lose all ability to do any coordination or motor skills. Trench foot is, for example, when you have your foot in a boot and you've been walking through water. So a lot of soldiers will get this, sometimes some homeless people will get this because their foot is exposed without the proper protection. And so what happens is it's cold water, but it's not frozen. And so it actually causes your skin to become very soft, and it sometimes will become pale from being cold. Sometimes the skin will start to come off a little bit from the exposure to the water. And so it's not actually freezing like in frostbite or in frost nip. It's just the constant cold exposure affects the skin and the way your body can regulate. Frost nip, the major way to treat it is to actually remove them from the cold. Bringing them out of the cold and not letting them get re-exposed, the tissue will thaw and those crystals will disappear. And again, frost nip means that there's no permanent damage, and so that's the best way to treat it. Frostbite is treated by also thawing the tissue, but the very important way of treating frostbite is that because those crystals are in there and there is some sort of damage in the tissue, you need to make sure that once you start de-thawing, they can't refreeze. And so this is a concern for people that are out in the wilderness or maybe won't be able to get inside quickly. It's actually more important to make sure that they don't refreeze. So not rethaw or not starting the thawing process until they know that they're out of that elements. And so the best way to treat for frostbite is prevention. So dressing appropriately, wearing clothing that is meant to help keep you warm, wearing good socks, and limiting your time outside. Hypothermia is best treated by removing them from the cold. And so this involves whether they have wet clothes, putting them in dry clothes, removing them from the outside temperatures, so putting them inside a house, inside an ambulance, inside anywhere that they're not exposed to the elements, giving them blankets to help them rewarming their core with maybe warm compresses or warm heating pads that are dry would be good for them as well if they were wet. And removing any constricting clothing to allow them to try to warm themselves are the best avenues. You can also give them some warm fluids, which will help their body produce heat as well. Trench foot is mainly wound care and removing it from the cold and the wet. So you would need to take the shoe off, take the sock off, dry the foot, allow it to completely dry, and then put on new warm dry socks and shoes, not letting them re-expose to the same equipment that they were in. One of the best ways to prevent these injuries before you go outside is preparation before you actually go into the cold weather. So this involves eating the correct amount of calories and hydration so that your body's metabolism can function the way it's supposed to and protect you against the cold weather. Wearing different types of layers, including moisture wicking clothes that help trap some of your body heat in but keep the moisture out, is a great way. Having warm, clean socks with backup socks are very important to protect your feet. Wearing gloves, hats, scarves, different protections for your different aspects of your body can help with those extremities that might not have as good of temperature regulation as your core. Another important thing is to avoid any alcohol or drug use, because that also can affect your body's metabolism and how well it can respond to the cold temperatures. There are some populations that are more vulnerable to cold-related injuries. Those are specifically the elderly and children or toddlers, babies, but also anyone that's outside in prolonged time. So this could be someone that's maybe homeless, someone that works outside, a hunter, or anyone that is outside doing any sort of activity. So metabolism is important in cold weather injuries, because if you don't have the appropriate nutrition and the appropriate stores of energy, then your body is not able to respond appropriately. So our shivering mechanism is a response that we will sweat and produce heat, but we need stores of energy. And so those people without those appropriate calorie stores inside their bodies aren't able to appropriately shiver. They aren't able to appropriately warm themselves if they haven't had those in advance.